While they were fighting in Europe, other United States soldiers were defending our country in the Philippines during World War II. The Japanese bombed there at the same time they were bombing Pearl Harbor. A documentary has just been completed by 3 area Tulsans about what happened in the late months of 1941 and the early months of 1942 during the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines. It was a battle the United States lost, and it was the largest American surrender since the American Revolution. The new documentary is not only about what led to the U.S. defeat there, but about an annual gathering in New Mexico where thousands converge every year for a marathon to pay tribute to those who died and who survived the Bataan Death March.
Welcome to the 20th Annual Bataan Memorial Death March.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
President Roosevelt's radio broadcast shocked the nation into the reality of a Second World War. What most Americans didn't know at the time was that 5,000 miles to the west, the Philippine Islands were also under attack by Japanese forces. These attacks occurred within 12 hours of the first bombs to fall on Hawaii, but are recorded in history as December 8th due to the international dateline. News of the Pearl Harbor attacks reached the Philippines quickly. At Clark and other airfields, crews frantically readied their aircraft to launch strikes on Japanese installations in Formosa. Unfortunately, those orders never came. Instead, Japanese bombers found the aircraft easy targets on the ground and reduced U.S. air power to scrap.
From there I went to Clark Field, was attached to the 28th Bomb Group. And then we heard of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they loaded our planes and was ready to make a run to Formosa, and General MacArthur would not allow us to take off for Formosa, and our planes were ruined. And on the Christmas Eve of 1941, we were made infantry and went to Bataan. From Bataan, I finally got down as far as Mindanao, ran out of land.
The destruction of Clark Field was a crippling blow to the Allied defense of the Philippines. Airmen were now infantry, fighting to slow the Imperial Army, but with no air support, the Japanese advance proved to be unstoppable.
The film is 95 minutes long, and it will soon be played at Tulsa Community College on October 3rd. Joining me now to talk about the project are 2 of the filmmakers, Jack Randal and Chad Henninger of Miracle Pictures. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Boy, what an undertaking. I watched this over the weekend. 95 minutes, and boy, it just captures you, and I can just see how much work went into this, because we're talking, was it 5,300 people that showed up?
There were over 5,300 marchers for this year's event, which is a record up from last year. They had 4,600, so it was a record-breaking year for them. And of course, the crowd. There were almost 12,000 between volunteers, family members, veterans in attendance. A lot of the survivors were there. There were maybe 12,000 people out there. So it was quite a crowd, and it's a very moving. It's a moving experience.
There's a lot of donations too. Boxes of fruit. You have to think about what it takes to put this type of event on. It's very impressive.
And this started back in the 1980s, correct? And it's just built from there by was it an ROTC group that started this?
Ray Pickering was a cadet at New Mexico State University, and he started it as a project. where he bet his commanders, what was the pizza?
Yes.
Or something, that he could get 25 people to show up to do it for a project. And then, of course, he spoke with, as you heard, like Gerald Church talking about, he spoke with the veterans there in Alamogordo and in Las Cruces, and wanted to name it the Bataan Memorial Death March to commemorate. So it started from there, and it quickly outgrew New Mexico State University and got moved out to White Sands, where it's been for,
This is the 20th, White Sands, yeah.
I'm drawing a blank right now exactly how long it's been at White
15
Sands.
years, I think.
15 years. And through this, I guess we're kind of bringing back the history of Bataan, because everybody's heard about Europe, but a lot of people don't know about Bataan.
Yeah, they don't, and I didn't know about it until this project. And once you go and you see what is put on every year and what they do every year for these veterans, it's just amazing.
Bataan, I guess, was something maybe we didn't hear about because there was a surrender involved, not
Right.
the troops so much. If you could tell me about
Right.
that.
Well, that's the problem with the Bataan history. Victory in Europe, and defeat in the Pacific. It was the largest surrender, that we've had in modern history, military surrender. So the defeat really kind of overwhelms the defense that these men put on. They fought off the first Japanese army that came in. They were the only U.S. troops fighting the enemy on the ground at that particular point in time in history. And then the second Japanese army that was on its way to Borneo, New Guinea, Australia was basically rerouted and committed into the theater to basically to rout them out of the Philippines. So it was a huge defeat. It was a big black eye for the U.S. at that time, kind of a loss for the home team, if you want to call it that.
And when the surrender was made, they captured both the Filipino soldiers and the U.S. soldiers, and they had to transport them 60 miles to prison camps, but they didn't really transport them via vehicles, which they had. They made them march,
Right.
which is what we hear about the Bataan Death March. So I'd like to show a little bit more of your film if we could. I think we pick it up here with historian Gerald Schertz and followed by survivor Ben Steele. Let's take a look at that.
They marched them out with no provisions for food, no provisions for water. They did not let them live off the terrain. They'd walk past artesianal springs where the water was coming out of the ground. They would not let them stop and get water. There are countless anecdotal stories of guys who tried to get water out of mud puddles and were bayoneted and killed for that. They had very little food. My own father was able to get a couple of hands full of rice only at one place, and many others, most of the others say the same thing. Certainly no one ate well. And it was tropical conditions. They were all suffering from beriberi, which is a nerve disease that attacks the extremities, both of the feet and hands. They were suffering from cerebral malaria, which is unique to the Bataan Peninsula. They were suffering from severe diarrhea, and dysentery is the clinical word for it, and with no provisions for maintaining sanitary conditions.
So the morning of I was captain morning of the 9th. The next morning of the 10th, started the Death March of Bataan. They even had guys that were out of the hospital in this march to start with. And they were one of the first ones to fall out. And after about the first day, people started to fall out. So they had cleanup squads coming behind the columns, and they'd bayonet you or shoot you or cut your head off or something. And the hatred was so intense. It was unbelievable. They spit on us and kicked dirt on us and everything, and the hatred was so bad. So we could see we were in deep trouble.
The Japanese brutality was not restricted to the captured soldiers. The native population were also subjected to savage beatings, rape, and torture. Those attempting to aid prisoners of war were murdered without question.